with Renee.
Yo. We wait all week and all day for more Saturdays with Renee.
Yeah, welcome everybody. Black Liberation Media, episode 96 of Saturdays with Renee, featuring Renee Johnston. I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your co-host, rocking the fresh new Saturdays with Renee merch. Happy Black August. Please like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon, do all the thing, put this in your social. Greetings, everyone. Big pun out the gate. Renee, how you doing today?
I am on the struggle, and this thing is telling me the internet is low, so I'm trying to figure out, like, do I need to shift and move myself to a different space? Can you hear me? Is the sound
telling me the same thing? And I think it's not. I think it's, again, this is I keep blaming StreamYard. Tafari in the building. Yeah, so what's up, James? Good to see you all out here. Peace, everybody. Peace. Yeah, 96. Episode 96. This is a good one. This is a really great way for this show's inaugural Black August. And yeah, you got, I mean, you know, get your merch up. But so I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, welcome. So, I just lost the, okay. And so should we get started? Should we get to it?
I think we just go. I mean, there's a lot, and I don't want to lose no time whatsoever. So
all right, well, let's get to the messenger of the grassroots, Dr. Brian Kwoba. Welcome back to the platform. Good to see you again. Author of the incredible new book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, on University of North Carolina Press. It is good to see you again. And
thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. You knew we were going to be, waiting on this. And
yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, long time coming, and you did not disappoint. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been waiting for this moment for a long time, So I'm grateful.
I'm gonna assume that's about Jared, because I haven't been here that long.
No, I've been with Jared before. It's just that the book, this is a book 12 years in the making, and the first time I was with Jared was probably probably 10 years ago. So much earlier.
Go back to the radio.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out to WPFW Pacifica in Washington, D.C. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
That's legit. So typically, Brian, what we do is allow our guests to introduce themselves so that I'm not reading and Jared doesn't have to rely on memory, which nobody wants. And so if you could briefly let the audience know who you are, where you're from, how you got here, all the origin things, as they call them.
I'm going to start with a couple lines from a poem that I wrote for Black Agenda Report back in the day. It goes a little something like this. If you really want to know me, take a look at the trees the apple fell from. My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya, went to school in a tin roof shack. His father, my grandfather, was a shopkeeper who had larger dreams for his son. Through hard work and perseverance, my father got a scholarship to study in a magical place, America. And while studying here, my father met my mother. She was born in a town on the other side of the world, in Kansas. Her father worked on oil rigs as a geologist. My grandmother, Toots, started out as a bank teller. These are the trees of my apple. So who am I? So this is actually not a poem about me. It's about Obama. But like Obama, I have a Black Kenyan father and a white American mother. And I was born in Connecticut, raised mostly in Boulder, Colorado, and Cincinnati, Ohio. And yeah, I ended up going to school in upstate New York, Cornell University for undergrad. Did a master's at Tufts and taught high school and middle school for a number of years. World history, US history, social studies. Ended up getting fired basically for my politics, to make a long story short. A story that I tell in the preface of the book. And that sent me back to get my doctorate. Ended up going to the University of Oxford in the UK and did a dissertation on Hubert Harrison. That started in 2013. And, I've been involved in a lot of activism over the years on a number of different issues: climate justice, Palestine, Black Lives Matter, socialism, third-party politics, immigrant workers' rights, and so on and so forth. And all of that informs the book, both my personal story in terms of wrestling with questions of race and identity, African-American identity, African, Kenyan identity, as well as, my studies and my scholarship and my activism. My first protest was in 2004, the one-year anniversary of the Iraq War of the George W. Bush era. And I love this story because I was holding up a banner that says "U.S. out of Haiti," an international socialist organization at the bottom, because I was an ISO member for a few years. And I remember there were these Bronx high school students just behind me. And 2004 was an election year, right? Bush was trying to get reelected. George W. Bush was trying to get reelected. And these Bronx high schoolers had the best chance, one of which I will never forget, which was, "Move, Bush, get out the way. Get out the way, Bush, get out the way." Riffing on Ludacris, obviously. So yeah, I started the PhD in 2013. It's been about 12 years to get the book out. And here we are. I'm super excited. Literally, like, I can't sleep because the book tour is just so energizing, and people are showing so much love and so much respect for the work, and really taking it up little by little. So yeah, I'm really excited to get into things and take the conversation wherever you want to go with it.
If you all don't mind, before we get to the serious stuff, I have a bit of trifle I wanted to ask about, because I can't help but notice.
Of course you do.
I can't help but know. I'm actually, all jokes aside, I'm curious, because you did say you went to Cornell, and you make reference to a number of Cornell-related Africana luminaries. But I didn't see a specific reference to the Africana Studies and Research Center. So I was curious. I know you were an undergrad there, and that I don't. Yeah. So I was just curious. Why? What was the relationship with the center?
Yeah.
I admit I have a bias and a sort of affinity for it. But I was just curious about that.
Let us start with a massive shout out to the late great Dr. James Turner, the founder of the Africana program at Cornell, which I know you came through, Jared. Funny story, I actually began to take a class with Dr. Turner in I can't remember if it was my sophomore or junior year. And I was politically unconscious for most of my undergraduate education, really until senior year. I was politically unconscious. And so I started to take, for example, when the Iraq War kicked off in 2003, I had no opinion about it. I wasn't for it. I wasn't against it. I literally just had no opinion. That's how politically unconscious I was. And so when I started to take Dr. Turner's class in Africana Studies at Cornell, it was so far over my head, like it was so beyond anything I'd ever grappled with. Because you have to understand, I grew up, I have a Black Kenyan father and a white American mother of British descent, but my parents split when I was very young, and I grew up with my mother. So I grew up in basically an all-white environment, mostly Boulder, Colorado. And I didn't have like a strong racial consciousness as a result of that, or political consciousness. And so Dr. Turner's class was so far over my head, I literally had to get like, I ended up dropping the class after just a week or two being in there. And it's funny because now I'm the director of African and African American Studies at the University of Memphis. So it's a full circle moment. And thankfully, I'm grateful to have built a relationship with Dr. Turner after I came to political consciousness my senior year. I went to Cuba in the summer of 2003 for 6 weeks on a Cornell undergraduate research program that I sort of designed a budget for. And that sparked my political consciousness. And I ended up, getting involved in activism when I got back my senior year. And after I graduated, I stayed in Ithaca for 2 years, and I would run into Dr. Turner, and we would have these great conversations because he was an avid listener, follower of Democracy Now! And so we'd always be talking about current events and, what's going on in the world. And I'm just grateful that I got to actually build a relationship and build some rapport with him after I had my political radicalization moment. Because, he's no longer with us, may he rest in power. But he's an important figure, obviously, in the field and certainly at Cornell. And so I'm grateful that at least after my undergrad experience, I got to know him and build a connection, even though I couldn't handle his class when I tried to take it at the time.
Most of us can't handle his classes at first run, so there's nothing to be ashamed about that. But yeah, no, I was just curious about that. Thank you for that, and definitely salute to him. And that's it, though. That's it. I will.
That wasn't nearly as bad as I thought you was going to do. So this.
Yeah, I was getting scared for a moment too. I was like,
no. The book is too good, and the work is too important. So I admit I just was curious about that as I was reading, and then also listening. I've been following Renee's lead a little bit and listening to some books, which does help keep up with all that we're trying to do around here. So I actually got through more of it than I thought. So Renee, how would you like to? I'll follow your lead here. How would you like to get us started in the actual discussion?
So I have like 4 pages of notes, which is too much, right? But I was just, as I was reading, like, just make it like, don't forget about this thing and don't forget about this comment. But I wanted to, so there's a question that I think is probably a question that I had written down that's a really good question to start with, and it's something that you acknowledge in the introduction. So David, King Pun, as we like to call him, says, I'm interested in the ways his book is similar and different from the 2-volume work by Perry on Harrison. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because your book is not a biography. And I think that's something that people really need to understand, is like, this is not a written history of the biography of Hubert Harrison. This is really a compilation of essays of all the things that were impacted by Hubert Harrison that people are probably unaware of, because he's virtually been written out of the history. I mean, I learned so much reading this book. I can't even like, this is like, for me, one of those things that reminds me why I'm always telling people they need to read more, right? Like, this is why we have the Hiram clip that always plays, you must read, beloved. Like, this is why the last time I found myself in Uncle Bobby's, I bought a shirt that says talk less, read more, right? Because there's so much that gets lost. And if it's not for people like you who decide to take 10, 12 years to research and read and do the history and to pull all of these things out, we don't have access to any of this information. So I said it before we started, I want to say it live again. I applaud you. This work is phenomenal. I really truly learned so much. And I'm so thankful that I got the opportunity to get this book in advance and be able to read it. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
If you could, I'm going to let you answer the question, because you basically explained this in the intro. And so I think it's an important place to start. So thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, the question of how does my work relate to Jeff Perry is one that I have gotten ever since I first started this project as a graduate student in 2013. It's a perennial question because most people who know about Harrison know about him through Perry's work, including myself. I first learned of Harrison reading a review of his book in the Socialist Worker, the old Socialist Worker newspaper, as an ISO member, and I eventually got Perry's book. I saw him speak at the Left Forum in New York, which would have been around 2009, 2010, and I got the first volume of his biography, and I got the Harrison Reader, and I was so fascinated by Harrison, and equally fascinated by the fact that no one I knew, including myself, had ever heard of him before. So that's what ultimately set me down the path to write a dissertation and then this book on Harrison. My work differs from my work. First of all, my work builds on Perry. I want to say at the outset that Perry laid an extraordinary foundation for a serious scholarly study of Harrison. He has a 2-volume biography of Harrison, which is detailed and meticulous like a reference work, which was great for me as a scholar, trying to say something new about Harrison. But at nearly 1,200 pages, not including footnotes, it's a bit daunting for the general reader. And so, part of what I'm doing in this book, it's a single volume treatment, and it's a thematic treatment. As you mentioned, it's not a strict traditional biography going through every, step of Harrison's life. Perry's already done that with a level of detail that only his 40 plus years of dedication could have produced. And at the same time as I'm building on Perry, I also differ from Perry in a number of ways. The analogy I use in the book is that, if you think of Perry focusing on the tree, Harrison as a tree, Perry's like detailing every little piece of bark and every little branch and twig and leaf of the tree. I'm looking at the tree in the forest, in the larger forest in which it existed, in the larger ecosystems, national and even global, in which Harrison took root, and to use that analogy. And so, so I do a lot more to sort of contextualize Harrison's world. But the other thing is that I have a decidedly, intentionally, and unapologetically Black and African angle of vision on Harrison. Perry was interested in Harrison primarily as an Irish-American socialist and trade unionist. And so Perry really emphasizes Harrison's, race and class politics, and mobilizes that to try to show people something about capitalism and white supremacy and the relationship between the two. I think those are really critical aspects of Harrison's thought. But, as a Black and African person myself, it was important to look at, well, what are the things that Perry might have left out, or what are the areas that he didn't really go into with as much depth? One example being the Garvey movement. I think many socialists, whether they're European American or not, can be very dismissive towards Garvey and Garveyism. I actually find Garvey and Garveyism very, very interesting, fascinating, actually. And so, I go into that, in a little more depth, I think, than Perry, or I give it a little more space in the book. And then the other thing is Harrison was a free lover. And this is an area that Perry just mentions in passing, right? But I find Harrison's free love politics, what I call Black free love politics, a extremely generative, if perhaps controversial, dimension of his radicalism, because it sort of opens a whole new window into how we think about gender and sexuality and sex and love and marriage, and the way that romantic life is connected to economic and political and social life. So yeah, in other words, I have a different angle of vision than Perry does, but I'm going into areas of Harrison's thought that Perry didn't necessarily address or didn't do so adequately.
No, that was perfect. And so as we're on Perry, just very quickly, Josh, who's in the chat, shout out Josh, and I were talking yesterday, and he was curious, and I wrote it down and promised him that I would ask if you had any difficulty getting like, did you work directly with Perry? Did you communicate directly with Perry? Was he part of the process for your writing, or was that not part of the process and you basically used his references and his book because you couldn't actually access him directly?
So I want to say something about my relationship to Perry and something about Robin D.G. Kelley and what he has shared with me. My relationship to Perry started out great. Perry was initially quite excited that somebody younger was interested in Harrison. And he even wrote me a letter of recommendation when I was applying to Oxford for the doctoral program. And, he was interested in sort of, I think, initially passing the torch, so to speak, or at least cultivating an interest in Harrison in a younger scholar like myself. Perry's a veteran, he was a veteran of the 1960s generation. And basically what happened was, after my first semester of grad school, in which I just read whatever I could on Harrison, which was mostly Perry's work, right? And some articles and other scattered things. I sent him this kind of one-page outline of some of the ideas that I thought I might be able to explore further as I got deeper into my PhD program. And suddenly he got very cold and basically from that point forward refused to have any substantive interaction with me whatsoever, which was devastating, to me, because I was just one semester into graduate school and I was thinking Perry was going to be my kind of unofficial advisor, right? Perry was not in the academy. He was a postal worker and a trade unionist. And so I he couldn't be my direct supervisor in the doctoral program, but he was the world expert on Harrison. And so I was thinking I would have his support throughout my program. Turns out what he said was he thought I was out to plagiarize him. And it's sad because not only was I not out to do that, but it cut me off from him in particular ways. However, there's also a silver lining there, I think, because I lost Perry's interest and support so quickly, it forced me to take a much more independent approach to Harrison, both in terms of finding sources, right? Perry didn't share. Initially, Perry was willing to share some of his materials and like give me leads on where to look for things. That all dried up very quickly. So I had to learn how to find my own sources, go to my own archives, like plot my own research agenda. And I think ultimately that was for the better, because I probably wouldn't have gone into some of the areas of Harrison's political legacy and thought that I did if I had been more under Perry's wing. Robin D.G. Kelley, I was with Robin just a month ago in Chicago at the Socialism Conference. He was joining me in conversation for the session we did on my book there. And Robin was like, man, you got to be harder on Perry. You got to take him to task, because the generation that Robin D.G. Kelley represents, I think they felt that Perry was hoarding the Harrison papers that he had collected, right? To Perry's credit, he did a lot of work to build interpersonal relationships and build trust with Harrison's descendants, such that they actually eventually granted him access to this huge trove of Harrison's papers that were apparently sitting in an apartment in New York for decades. Harrison's scrapbooks, his diaries, his own books with notations in the margins, many writings that were oftentimes unpublished. And that's to Perry's credit that he was able to build those kind of relationships such that the family trusted him and gave him access to these papers. And thankfully, Perry deposited some chunk of them gave them to Columbia, what now forms the Hubert Harrison papers at Columbia University. I think Perry had a lot of stuff that he didn't give them, but then when Perry transitioned a couple of years ago, there was a new trove of Perry's research files that Columbia acquired. And so I was able to go through those as well. But But, you know, Robin was saying like, yeah, he wouldn't let us see those papers. He was sitting on them. He was treating them as his private property.
So did
And
Kelly call him out? Has Kelly called him out? I mean, I think it's interesting that someone of his stature would want you to do more. It's like, come on, bro, you at the top of the game, man. You call him out.
That part,
Why I gotta do
that part.
Well, I don't know if he's done it publicly. I'm sure he has. I mean, certainly when we were on stage, you know, in Chicago, he was pushing me to like say more and be more critical, because he's right on some level, right? I mean, for a white person to treat Hubert Harrison's papers as private property is problematic, frankly, because okay, maybe Perry was worried that people would misuse them or misinterpret them. But of course, there's plenty of scholars, particularly Black scholars, who were more than qualified to look at those papers before, you know, the early 2000s when Perry finally gave them over and made them publicly accessible. Robin D.G. Kelley is just one example, right, of a scholar who wanted to and should have and could have had access to them had Perry not been so guarded about them. So I relate to that criticism because, you know, I too lost access to Perry and so I can relate to the feeling. But again, it's like, you know, it raises questions about who owns history. And too often, you know, some people think that they have a proprietary claim on our history, which is, again, just obviously problematic.
But also par for the course. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Jared.
wouldn't be the first or the last time.
I was just, I just fully agree with the point. I just, you know, and part of it, I'm, you know, through my own limited experience, I've been frustrated for many, many years at the reluctance of senior scholars with prominent positions and names not taking some of these positions against other scholars publicly, and then often behind the scenes or quietly on panels at conferences calling for it to be done. And I know, you know, I've certainly over years felt pushed to do things because I didn't have this stature. And I'm thinking it would be great if I looked up and had some cover. So I just found that interesting. But in general, it's correct. If Perry behaved that way, absolutely. And I, for one, would have loved to have heard about that years ago. For instance, when we hosted him for an interview here some years ago, I would have loved to have been aware of a controversy brewing around him hoarding over the papers and then only deciding, because I've also had issues with others. This, I think, is a kind of a perennial problem where these elite universities get the hold of all these papers. And then with the promise that they'll be readily available to any and everyone, but that's not always how it works. So anyway, but in general, I'm glad that you found your way around it, because clearly your work has not suffered from a lack of access to Perry's papers, at least as I can tell, you know. But, yeah.
No, and this answers actually a question that I had about some of the notes with, like, you know, the pictures and some of the things that you shared coming from Columbia University. I didn't follow Perry's work at all, so I don't, you know, wasn't familiar, you know, I wasn't aware that was where it ended up, which brings up a whole other plethora of, so you didn't give it to the Black people, but you gave it to fucking Columbia University. But okay.
Yeah, that part I actually don't know. I don't know why Columbia got them and not, for example, the Schomburg Center, you know. I don't know.
Right.
That we would have to ask Perry, but we can't, because, you know, he's no longer walking this earth.
But this is also par for the course, as I said. Like, when I think about, you know, we had this, Jared and I are extreme disagreement about the coup d'etat movie, right? And part of my issue with the coup d'etat movie is, why is this white man telling this story, right? And it's because he was given the access. And so, like, why is it that we are continuously forced to engage with the very people who are at the core of our oppression in order to understand our histories. Like, this is why our histories are so like, like just completely obscured and intentionally unclear for us. And then you have to jump through these hoops and go through, the rigmarole in order to tell a story that directly impacts you, right? Like the fact that like he had this history, and admittedly, like I didn't read his 2 volumes. I didn't any of it. I was familiar with Hubert Harrison, but only because I read CBS's book on her Black Scare, Red Scare book. So when I saw the name, I was like, wait, I know this name. And I was like, oh, CBS, that's the book. That's where I heard, So
yeah,
it wasn't but it's just like this whole idea. And then it actually directly relates to what you talk about in the book, right? Because at the core of it, Hubert Harrison is basically like, yo, we need to worry about us. We need to focus. And it's very interesting.
I mean, it's sad when conservative or liberal white folks are gatekeeping, but it's especially sad when someone who prided himself on his supposed opposition to white supremacy, that he couldn't see that he couldn't reach the position of humility and respect to recognize that there are things that people of African descent can and will see in Harrison that an Irish American might not, right? Or ways that we might relate to Harrison, ways that we might resonate with what he's doing, that reveal things more readily to us than to other people. So, yeah, I mean, all this criticism is warranted. But the good news is, Harrison, the full scope of Harrison's, radicalism has been, I think, hidden in part for this reason. But that ends now, because my book really, as I said, goes into areas that Perry doesn't explore, and it goes into areas that he did explore, but from a different angle of vision. And so I'm happy to say that, I'm proud of this work. I put blood, sweat, and tears in it. This is the thing I keep forgetting to tell people, is like, you're not just buying a book, you're buying a piece of my heart and soul. Because I mean, Harrison is just the kind of figure that it's like, you got to come correct or don't come at all, right? Like, I'd rather you not do a half-assed writing about Harrison. You got to either do it right or don't do it. And I believe that I've done it right. And Robin does too. I just have to say this as well. Robin, has the first blurb on the back of my book, the first sentence of which just is so humbling and so gratifying. He said, Brian Kwoba has written a beautiful intellectual biography as radical and original as its subject. And that just, really, really validates, I think, my work. I mean, this is the guy who wrote the book on Freedom Dreams, among others, the Black Radical Imagination. So for him to say that, means a lot. And I think puts us in a position now to really lean into Harrison in ways that we really couldn't before.
And you do. So if I may, there's just to throw some topics out there and show a little bit of what I think, and it seems you've done here. You talk accurately about Harrison being among the leading giant intellectuals and activists of his day, being race first, being internationalist, being socialist, being agnostic. You described a moment ago free love. You even, if I heard correctly, suggest he may have had some homosexual relationship with Claude McKay. It sounded like you were saying that. It sounded like you were saying. It sounds like you. But let me run through the. You said.
Go ahead.
You talk. Harrison was hating on everybody. He was hating on the Harlem Renaissance. He was hating on Du Bois. He was hating on Garvey. I mean, when you talk about Perry, didn't want to deal much with Garvey, in an odd way, that sounds even more odd given how much Perry wrote, but there's a lot for a non-Garvey supporter to dig into, given Harrison's critique. I mean, Garvey does not come off looking good in this situation. You talk about, I thought beautifully, and I definitely would want to come back to this, the Liberty Party and his approach to electoral politics. You talk about this, what I definitely was new to me, this slick, my description of some slick, kind of petty engagement for literary purposes, I should be clear, between Harrison and Amy Ashwood Garvey. I was like, that is this dude. And then, you talk also about what I did like to see is that, because I did admit, I think I'm getting socially conservative as I get old. When you were talking about his extramarital affairs, I was like, oh man. But then you also were saying that he also seemed to come and go with the house, go back and forth at the house. But he was also clear to be a constant father to his children, even as he was moving around quite freely with his love. So there's a lot. I just wanted to, for our audience, to get a little bit. There's so much here. And if I could, just starting backwards, and then Renee, you can obviously, is this, you talk about the in a progressive way, his approach to free love, but let me just play old cliche conservative man response. Because I'm reading it like, is this free love and advanced politics, or is this just my man doing his thing and just saying and coming up with justifications for it because he's so brilliant? How advanced and progressive and evolving is it really to have the free love experience that he was having? But anyway, and then correct any of what you feel I got wrong in my summary there of any of that.
Well, yeah, that was a beautiful kind of quick hot take on a bunch of the themes that I cover in the book. If I can add to that, there's a whole chapter on Harrison's radical, what he called colored internationalism, and there's also a whole chapter
and stuff about the earth and the environment. I mean, there's a lot there. Sorry to cut you off, but yeah, just somebody also didn't cover.
Yeah, there are insights that I gleaned from my experiences in the climate justice movement, absolutely, in the book. There's a whole chapter on what I call the outdoor grioversity, which is this, extraordinary sort of social and community institution of street corner speaking in Harlem. Harrison was a pioneer of the stepladder on the street corner, and he would speak to audiences that were large enough to block traffic, because he had such a brilliant mind and was so determined to share that knowledge with the people. And the Russian Revolution is a recurring theme in this book, because that was an ongoing reality, an unfolding process during Harrison's lifetime, which he was relating to and thinking about. There's a lot in this book, and I you should tell me where to start, because otherwise it's gonna feel like we're trying to take everything.
I started with the question, just working backwards, but you can pick up on any of just with the point about this. I ended on the point about free love, and I was just raising a question, just as because you described it earlier, and it's described in the book in an sort of an advanced humanistic approach. And I just admit I was having, again, I'm my own, conservative aging bias for for like, slow down, my guy, like, like he just was. And so I admit I was reading it and thinking, you could read this, somebody could say this is me being advanced in my thought, and it could also seem like a justification for just being able to sleep with anybody he was interested in at the time. And that was it.
Let me start with a quote by the Black feminist scholar Jennifer Nash in her article Black Sexualities. She says, "What happens if we imagine Black subjects as desiring and desirous? How can we carefully theorize Black pleasures and Black longings? What happens if we work to unleash Black sexual imaginations, to cultivate Black erotic longings, and to advocate for Black sexual freedoms? Ultimately, this work reminds us again and again that sexual world-making and political world-making go hand in hand, that Black political and Black sexual freedom are one and the same. So it's not just Harrison that is seeking erotic liberation in the Harlem of the 1910s and 20s. You have the blues women, for example, who are probably the most free sexually in the whole country, if not the world, because their lyrics are giving voice to women's bodily autonomy, women's independence, including financial independence, women's same-sex relationships, and non-monogamous relationships. So Harrison is not the only one doing this, right? There's Alain Locke, there's Claude McKay, there's Zora Neale Hurston, there's Amy Ashwood Garvey, there's W.E.B. Du Bois. There's a whole number of folks who are not confining their romantic and sexual lives to one person only. And Harrison, what makes Harrison so special is that, let me just lay it out for a second, right? Harrison is the first Black figure in US history to call for decriminalizing access to contraception, to give a lecture series on sex education, to denounce church and state repression of sexuality, and to defend a love style based on freedom and variety, on the grounds in part that we are not monogamists by nature. And this is why the argument is so profound. We haven't even begun to grapple with the implications of this, even though Harrison is doing this in the 1910s before the experimentation of the so-called Harlem Renaissance and the queer sexualities that are blossoming and emerging from the blues women and all those other figures that I mentioned, and many that will remain unnamed because it was just a thing in Harlem at that time. And so, basically the argument goes like this. And I put that chapter, I have a whole chapter in the book on this because it's so important, right? Chapter 6, it's called Black Free Love Politics and the Queer New Negro. Harrison was able to connect capitalism and colonialism and Christianity and white supremacy to compulsory monogamy. And what I mean by that is monogamy by itself is just a way of relating, which says that the maximum acceptable, legitimate, respectable number of sexual or romantic partners a person can have is one, right? Compulsory monogamy
at a time.
one at a time. Yeah, one at a time. Right. Compulsory monogamy is taking that particular idea of, maximum of one at a time and imposing it on everybody and saying this is compulsory for everybody. One size fits all. And there's so much evidence that this is not natural to humans. If you look at indigenous cultures all around the world, right, there's a whole wide variety of erotic energy exchange traditions, and none of them made monogamy compulsory, right? None of them made monogamy the center of the universe in matters of sex, love, and marriage. You have, for example, plural marriage or polygamy in many indigenous cultures. Now, Robin said something funny in Chicago. He was like, but wait, polygamy is not free love. And I was like, no, that's not my argument. I'm just saying that the preponderance of polygamous marriage all around the world, in Africa, in the Islamic world, in Latin America, in indigenous cultures in the Americas before colonization, that just is one piece of evidence that we're not monogamous by nature. Because if we were monogamous by nature, you wouldn't have such a global preponderance of non-monogamy or non-monogamous ways of relating in terms of sex and love and marriage that we find, right? And so that's one piece of the argument. But the other piece of the argument is, if you want to understand how sexually repressive our culture is, and it is extremely sexually repressive even today, even though there have been gains made, right? Even though we have challenged a lot of the sexually repressive practices. Look at the history of state repression, for example, right? People might have heard of the Comstock laws, right? These are federal laws named for Anthony Comstock, who waged a vicious campaign to try and imprison Victoria Woodhull, who was a kind of pioneering free lover. And by the way, let me just define free love in her words, because she put it very well. She said, "Yes, I'm a free lover. I have an inalienable constitutional and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please. And with that right, neither you nor any law you can frame have any right to interfere." Basically, the idea that the church and the state should not be the ones regulating how we love and who we relate to. And that the basis for sexual relations shouldn't be a marriage contract from the state or the blessing of a priest in a monogamous Christian marriage, but instead love. That love should be the basis for sexual and romantic sexual relations. Comstock tried to wage a campaign to get this woman imprisoned because he was this right-wing conservative Christian, sort of zealot. And he failed to imprison Woodhull, but he was able to lobby Congress and the government to pass the Comstock laws. And these are laws that criminalized all manner of things sexual on the grounds that they were obscene. And anything that Comstock deemed obscene could be criminalized, punished, and so on. So you find, for example, a situation where in the late 1800s, early 1900s, contraceptives were illegal. Abortion was illegal. Sex toys were illegal. Extramarital sex was illegal. Anal sex was illegal. Oral sex was illegal. Sex education pamphlets were illegal. Sex work was illegal. Erotica was illegal. Paintings depicting too much skin could be deemed obscene and criminalized. Novels with sexual content.
No, I'm just playing. No, you're right. I'm just playing.
So all this stuff was illegal. And it just shows you how intense the state repression was. I mean, Comstock, bragged about the fact that he got, when Madame Restel, this abortion provider, slit her wrists because of her fear of persecution and imprisonment. Comstock bragged about the fact that this was the 15th person that he had driven to suicide, right? I mean, you just, it's hard to even imagine how repressive the situation was, and not to mention church repression of sexuality, right? Because as we can all imagine, the church had a very sex negative morality. What Harrison called these folks the Puritanic prudes, right? Because most Christian churches opposed contraception and abortion and sex outside of marriage and masturbation and sex work and homosexuality, right? And then on top of that, you have the anti-Black or the racial oppression, the sexual dimension of racial oppression, right? You have the image of the hypersexualized Jezebel for Black women versus the asexual Mammy, also for Black women. And then, of course, the image of the Black male brute, right? Where Black men were considered deviant and threatening to white women's purity, and by extension to white masculinity. And so in this context of church repression, state repression of sexuality, anti-Black repression of sexuality, to come out as a Black free lover was no joke, right? It's not something, it was a very risky thing to do, in fact, because as we know, many times Black men were lynched because of supposedly raping, quote unquote, a white woman, which was a myth that people like Ida B. Wells exposed as such, right? Ida B. Wells exposed the fact that a lot of these relations were consensual, but once they got discovered, the white woman would cry rape in order to preserve her white community status and not be seen as a Negro lover, right? And so this is why I think Harrison's positions are so profound, because he's basically overturning this whole sexually repressive apparatus in ways that other thinkers later would take up. People like Audre Lorde, for example. Audre Lorde, in The Uses of the Erotic, speaks about how every type of oppression, like oppression, part of how oppression works is that it deprives oppressed people of any type of source of energy that they could use to fight back, right? And she's talking in that essay particularly about the erotic suppression of women, right? And women's erotic energy being suppressed. And there's a long history of that, right? Witch burnings and chastity belts and, nymphomania and all these, these kind of clinical designations. And what Audre Lorde is saying about the suppression of women's erotic energy and power applies directly to Black men in this period, because lynching oftentimes included castration, right? Which is a direct attack, not just on Black masculine erotic power, but on Black manhood more generally, right? And so, when we put the whole picture together, and that's why I had to write a whole chapter about this. You begin to realize that this system of compulsory monogamy wouldn't need so many laws and so many church injunctions, right? And so much racial violence if it were natural.
Thank you for that.
So the thing, yeah, and that was people are gonna laugh at me, because anybody who watched like the propaganda thing that we just did got a real kick out of me. Yeah, like get the book. So you have to really read this book to understand like how, like, there's no way we're gonna get to everything at all, even close, like in this little time span that we have. And I would welcome continued conversations, because I feel like everything you tackle in this book can go exactly like everything that you just said. Although you talk about a lot of the, some of the things in the book, in the chapter, like that is a true expansion, right? Like it's not like a lot of that's not even part of the book. So this just means you have to keep coming back so we can keep expanding on all these conversations.
Happy to come back anytime. And I'm glad we have some time now to get into all the other parts of the book that you guys found interesting.
There was so much. So for me, when we talk about, free love and the politics of marriage and all of these things, to me, this is all part of the capitalist structure, right? Like when people talk about marriage, it is not in the sense of how are these two people going to survive in this life of trying to support each other and love. It's the wedding, right? And what is a wedding? It is a capitalist venture, right? It's all about who you're paying for the flowers, who you're paying for the music, who you're paying for the venue, who you're paying for the food. Like, that's why I don't celebrate Valentine's Day. I'm like, I don't need one day of the year for my husband to decide that he loves me. Like, love me all of the other days. And then on Valentine's Day, we can like sit in the house and like eat and do what we normally do on any other day, because you can spend all of the other days of the year proving to me that you love me. Like, waiting for February 14th to prove that you love me, to me, is like the wildest like thing ever. And I think a lot of people misunderstand and misconstrue that when you look at when you fight a structure, like all of these things are part of the structure, right? Like this whole monogamy, you have to get married, like all of these things are a business for people. Right? Like it's a way for other people to make money off of a structure that you have been told you have to live in. And I'm monogamous. I've been with my husband almost 20 years. Like, this is not about, like me saying, well, I do whatever, but it's really trying to get people to understand how deeply, deeply propagandized we are to believe that these rules and policies that have been put in place that are oppressive in every way, shape, and form are really there so somebody else can make money. Like, it's really not about humanity and people, and you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that raises the other dimension of Harrison's analysis. One of his lectures on sex, he spoke about the historically contingent nature of human sexuality, that it changes across time and space, right? And what he says is that it's a kind of classical Marxist analysis for people who are familiar with works like, Engels, The Family, Private Property, and the State. This idea that monogamy actually flows from, it's a ruling class formation, because the ruling class wants to know who are the ruling class men specifically want to know who are their quote unquote legitimate heirs, right? So that they can understand who to pass down their wealth to. And so it's always been this kind of hypocritical monogamy for women only, but not for the ruling class men. They can do what they want, but they do want to know who to pass their wealth down to. So this whole privatization of the family, the so-called nuclear family, right, is very much about wealth, and that's why the state is so involved in marriage as a legal contract and all the rest of it. There's a tradition, a tradition of there's a free love tradition. First of all, that's the other thing that I learned in writing this chapter. Historians, we often say, well, everything has a history, right? And so I realized, oh, there's a history. There's a white sex radical, a European American sex radical tradition that goes back at least to the 19th century in terms of the free love movement, and those folks. There was a free love wing of white women's rights advocates, right? White women. There was a wing of white women's rights advocates, people like Victoria Woodhull, for example, who said, yes, patriarchy makes women into property, and that's exactly why we're free lovers. Because we don't want to be property, we want to be free. But let me get back to Jared's question, because there's another aspect to this that I think I don't want people to misunderstand. Some people might think that, well, okay, yeah, this is fine, free love, whatever, for men, but or that this might come more naturally to men, but for women, maybe not so much. And here's where I have to invoke a figure that Harrison greatly respected and admired, as a literary great, and that's Mark Twain. Mark Twain had this joke. I'm going to kind of summarize it, but it was this hilarious response to this idea that free love is more natural for men than for women. He said, "Now here's an example of men's reasoning powers, as he calls them. You observe certain facts. For instance, in all his life, he never sees the day that he can satisfy one woman, and also that no woman ever sees the day that she can't overwork and defeat and put out of commission any 10 men that can be put to bed to her. He puts these two strikingly suggestive and luminous facts together, and from them draws the astonishing conclusion: the Creator intended the woman to be restricted to one man." So this is a funny joke, because I think most of us who have thought about this realize that women generally have a much greater sexual capacity than men. They are the bearers of life. They are portals for life to come into this world. And the blues women, again, really are giving voice to that when they are giving voice to their same gender love, their queer relationships, and their non-monogamous relationships. They're sort of pointing towards a certain kind of erotic liberation that we still haven't caught up with, frankly, in many ways. I mean, obviously there are communities, there's more literature and more communities that are talking about polyamory, that are talking about open relationships, that are talking about ethical non-monogamy than ever before, probably. But still, it's quite a taboo subject. And I think that the idea that only men and not women want to have variety and freedom in their sexual and romantic lives is actually a sexist idea, right? It actually discounts the sexual capacity of women and makes it seem like women are less sexual or less desiring or have less capacity than men, when frankly it appears to be the opposite.
That's wild. Yeah. So much.
Clutch your pearls, y'all. Clutch your pearls.
Pearls.
Oh, mine were fully clutched. I admit, I was reading
already.
This, I can't. I was
hysterical.
For those who are still wondering about this book, I submit to you humbly that chapter alone is worth the price of admission. But it's only one of 9.
No, but seriously, but all of them are. I mean, but please don't anyone misunderstand my quick overview and breakdown. I mean, everything in here is so well researched. You cover a lot of nuance. It's written very well. something I know we want to get to is his conflict with Garvey, and the way you write that history and interweave how he responded to it. There are so many lessons for those of us who are trying to be involved in some sort of public activism or organizational work or intellectualism, in terms of how you describe Harrison's engagement or refusal to engage in certain public beefs. I mean, good Lord. I mean, and then his erasure as a result of some of all of this. And I know that's a huge problem that still exists today in terms of even elite academic gatekeeping, even in Black and left of center circles. So, I mean, this is, so Renee, but I just wanted to do that to bring it back. And Renee, I wanted you, let you, have you, I just wanted to.
A lot. There's a lot. And I feel a little all over the place, which is not my normal, like how I go, but
we can talk about Garvey if you want. I mean,
I was gonna say, because there's someone in the chat that's like chomping at the bit and can't wait, and I'll give you my little bit of history, which is that both of my parents are Jamaican and my mother is from St. Anne's, which is where Garvey's from. And so the funny story of my family is we're not Garveyites. I was not raised in that at all. But one of the jokes that my family has always had was how pompous Marcus Garvey was. And this whole, like, the pictures and the clothes and the hats and the, like the whole thing, like this was a joke when I was, like it was hysterical that this man like saw himself, in this like his whole method of being, right? And that this somehow translated to like this massively like revolutionary Black. When you look at him, he's literally dressed as if he thinks he's part of the British Guard. Like it's hysterical, like for me, right? So reading these chapters for me, I was like, this is great. This is fantastic, because I'm not crazy. Like my family's not crazy to be like, something's not quite right with this story.
If there's ever an academic get your popcorn read, this is it.
I see.
I was at the
I thought I saw Jared clutching some other pearls on behalf of all the Garveyites.
Oh no, I am, I am. I'm like, and to all my Garveyites, you're welcome. You could come through. We'll have the conversation. Take your notes, and I'll be waiting for the emails. But yeah.
Listen. It is a lot, but I welcome if you could talk about this a little, because I am one fascinated by the erasure, right? Like I am fascinated that you can read an entire history on Garvey and not see Harrison in any of this, given their apparent clear work that they did together, right? Like it's fascinating to me. But the Garveyites are going to come for you, and for that I apologize in advance. But I feel like ADOS comes for me all the time, and I survive it. So I feel like you'll survive it. We'll all be okay. Right?
I'm ready to rumble because I brought all the receipts to the table. But first, before we get into the critique of Garvey, I really want to honor the massive impact of Garvey and Garveyism. I mean, let's talk about this, right? Because I have two whole chapters on Harrison's relationship to Garvey and Garveyism, because I take it so seriously, right? I mean, the Garvey movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League was the largest transnational organization of African people that we've ever seen. And for those of us who seek transnational African unity, you can't get around that fact. There's no such thing as a serious study of African nationalism, Black nationalism, Black internationalism that does not actually engage with Garvey and Garveyism. I mean, Garvey had an impact on Kwame Nkrumah, right? On Jomo Kenyatta, on the whole first generation of African nationalists. Garvey had a massive impact on figures like Malcolm X, because as we know, both of Malcolm's parents, Earl Little and Louise Little, were active Garvey movement members, UNIA members in Michigan, where Malcolm, was largely raised. So we have to honor that, I think. What I try to show in my first chapter is that Harrison has a very fascinating place in all this, right? Because on the one hand, he catalyzes the rise of Garvey and Garveyism through the Liberty League of Negro Americans, which I'll come back to in a second. And on the other hand, he has this devastating critique because of his firsthand experience with Garvey, right? So let's start with the impact of the Liberty League. Garvey and Amy Ashwood, when they founded the UNIA in 1914 in Jamaica, their original idea was to build a Tuskegee-style institute in Jamaica. So he's writing letters to Booker T. Washington, appealing for funding, appealing for support, saying that he wants to address the race problem along the lines of Tuskegee, including, getting white support and white donors involved in setting up a brick and mortar school. He comes to the US, he takes a tour around the country, and he ends up in Harlem in 1917, where Harrison is inaugurating the Liberty League of Negro Americans. This is an organization that had a race first program, or Africa first, if you look at the membership card. It had a mass movement orientation, right? The inaugural meeting of the Liberty League had 2,000 people packed into the Bethel Church in June of 1917. The Liberty League had a tricolor flag, the black, brown, and yellow, which was meant to symbolize peoples of color, Black folks and people of color all around the world and their relationship to each other, right? And so these are some of the elements. When Garvey gets to Harlem, he joins Harrison's Liberty League. This is something that has been sort of marginalized in the Garvey movement historiography and origin story of Garveyism. And so, but what you realize is that is where Garvey learned a lot of these strategies and tactics that he used to build the UNIA into this global transnational mass movement for Black, self-determination or Black empowerment and advancement. Because how can we have Garveyism without a race-first doctrine, without a mass movement orientation, without an internationalist perspective, right? That is Harrison's impact, decisive, catalyzing impact on the rise of what we think of now as Garveyism. And so, and it gets so large, right, that Garvey ends up tapping Harrison to edit the Negro World, the Garvey movement newspaper, and Harrison agrees, and he starts editing the Negro World because the Liberty League by that time was kind of floundering, or as I say in the book, the rise of the Garvey movement was sort of a phoenix rising from the ashes of the Liberty League, so to speak. And so Harrison is at the helm of the Negro World as editor-in-chief, right? And in that capacity, he's viewing Garvey in very up close and personal settings. And he's developing a number of misgivings about Garvey. To give one example, Garvey envisioned, to use his words, quote, uniting a scattered Negro race who before the close of many centuries will found an empire on which the sun shall shine as ceaselessly as it shines on the empire of the North today. That's from an article Garvey wrote in 1913. Harrison is not an advocate of empire of any kind, Black or otherwise. He's an anti-imperialist. In fact, from his position at the helm of the Negro World, he writes an article, for example, in 1921 called Wanted, a Colored International. And what he says there is that basically what we need is not a white international like the Socialist International, the Second International, or the Communist International, which was the Third International. He says, we need a colored international. Quote, a call should be issued for a Congress of the darker races, which should be frankly anti-imperialistic and serve as an international center of cooperation from which strength may be drawn from several sections of the world of color. The Congress should be made up of those who realize that capitalist imperialism, which mercilessly exploits the darker races for its own financial purposes, is the enemy which we must combine to fight. So you can see here a perfect example of Harrison's political difference with Garvey. Garvey wants a Black empire over which the sun will never set. And Harrison says, no, capitalist imperialism is the enemy we must fight, right? And that's just one example. I mean, Harrison witnesses the first UNIA International Convention in 1920 up close, and he sees Garvey's authoritarian behavior. Garvey's, unfortunately, he's like a case study in the HNIC problem, right? That Garvey wants to be the center of the universe. He wants to have all the power. And Harrison's complaint was that Garvey cannot tolerate people in his organization that are smarter or that have ideas that don't go along with his. He wants yes men. That's basically what Harrison says about Garvey. He wants people to be loyal, right? And to follow whatever Garvey's plans and notions end up being. And this is why the Garvey movement was not able to retain so many talented lawyers, doctors, folks, Hubert Harrison, right? Because of that sort of top-down, rigid authoritarian structure, which very much did emulate in some ways the Napoleons and the Hitlers of the world, as Garvey himself, extolled at times. And so, when it comes to Garvey's fixation with capitalism, building an empire based on the accumulation of capital, even if it's in the hands of Black capitalists, Garvey's imperialism. Garvey looked to the Zionist movement. Here's a place that, we, again, haven't, I think, understood enough about what's limited about Garveyism. Garvey says very explicit on multiple occasions, if the Jews can have Palestine, why can't we have something in Africa? Now, in this day and age, that doesn't age very well, right? Because we've seen the results of Jewish Zionism in Palestine. And that is not a model for redemption of anything or anyone, to put it mildly. So, there's a number, and this is a place where people, I think, have misunderstood Harrison's problem with Garvey. They think it's like a personality difference or something. Like, no, these are serious political differences about how Black people should organize and what the strategy should be, right? What the sort of aim and goal should be of our organization, of our building unity, in so many ways. And so I think that's what's unique about Harrison, is that to those who poo-poo Garvey and Garveyism, including many socialists and Marxists, Harrison shows actually how Garveyism came to be out of a Black radical kind of orientation, a mass movement orientation, an internationalist orientation, right? A race-first orientation, given the white supremacy and anti-Black oppression that Black folks faced. On the other hand, Harrison is like, he sees where Garvey is trying to take the UNIA, and Harrison is trying to push it in a different direction. Harrison from within, and this is what's different about Harrison's critique. Unlike a W.E.B. Du Bois, who's critiquing Garvey from outside the UNIA, or a Cyril Briggs, who's critiquing Garvey from outside the UNIA, or an A. Philip Randolph, who's critiquing Garveyism from outside the UNIA. Harrison is a dues-paying member. He's the editor of the Negro World. His critique is internal, and that's why it's so devastating, right? Because he's able to say, look, he exposes Garvey from an angle that we don't often get, right? And that's, I think, why it's so important to take seriously what Harrison is saying about Garvey and Garveyism, because he knows what he's talking about, Harrison in many ways represented Garveyism before Garvey came in terms of the Liberty League orientation. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Sorry, go ahead, Renee. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Just real quick, because I see people like wigging out in the chat about stuff. And I want to make it clear, like, Garvey to me is a prime example of why we can't associate everything with a person, right? So my issue with regard to Garvey and Garveyism, and it is not that, the clothes aside, that is a joke, because the man, he was born in Jamaica, and at that time in Jamaica, regular people did not dress like that. Period. So y'all can be mad at me all you want, but these are facts, right? And if you Google a picture, one of the primary pictures of Garvey that always pops up is him with the hat so stop, y'all stop.
But it's also but it's deeper than that in the book. And the problem that I see in the chat, obviously, is that people have not read the book.
They haven't read the book, right?
So let's start there. And they probably haven't read about Harrison, period. And part of the reason that they haven't is connected to what Professor Kwoba writes in your book. You write in your book about Garvey's participation in the erasure of Harrison in part because of their disagreements. But you really do make this powerful point, and make it well, that you just did there, that Harrison was not like these other critics. He was a race first, Black African internationalist first,
He
who
taught.
worked within the Garvey movement and helped Garvey get himself started. So the criticisms from Harrison, if even if you end up not agreeing with them, should be taken with much more consideration than those defenders of Garvey might want to give room for, to the Briggses and the Du Boises and everyone else's. Sorry, please go ahead.
I want to put express it even stronger than you did just now, Jared. Harrison taught Garvey race first.
That part. So, but I'm going to interrupt you only because this is my point, right? It is not about Garvey. And that is my problem with Garvey and Garveyism. It should not be about him. And so for people to say, well, Garvey is why Malcolm X. No, Malcolm X is because his family was Pan-Africanist. Like, the point was Africa first. The point was Black first. It's not because Garvey, it is because Garvey was part of he was one piece of a struggle that people latched onto, because people have a tendency to latch onto a person instead of an ideological framework. And this is why we lose, right? Because the minute the person is gone, so is the organization. So is the work.
Brian, right? Before you go back to your point, I also I forgot to add that what you point out also in the book about this point about the clothing, it's not just that Harrison or anyone else was making fun of the clothing. It was, you point out specifically that Harrison was saying the clothes reflect a political orientation that Garvey had towards the West, towards that European monarchy. And This was part of an overall flawed approach that was seeping in to an analysis that he evolved as race first, that, as you say, that was learned from Harrison. So it's again, that's why I'm saying it's important people read the book and get the nuance and the way that. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
Let me just start with that point, and then maybe go to a different one, which is Harrison taught Garvey the race first doctrine. For example, in 1915, before Garvey encountered Harrison, he was emphasizing that because so many Black Jamaicans were engaged in, quote, villainy and vice of the worst kind, immorality, obeah, and all kinds of dirty things, unquote, that the UNIA, that his task, Garvey's goal, was to, quote, go among the people and help them up to a better state of appreciation among the cultured classes and raise them to the standard of civilized approval. To do this, we must get the cooperation and sympathy of our white brothers. This is the Booker T. Washington model, okay? Booker T. Washington got funding from people like Andrew Carnegie, right? Because industrial education was seen to be non-threatening enough or stabilizing enough in the Jim Crow South that Rockefeller and Carnegie and some of these robber barons saw the utility in it. Not to mention the colonial powers like Germany and Britain that saw the utility of the Tuskegee model for stabilizing colonial rule in Africa itself. But when Garvey gets to, so it's I think people forget that initially Garvey had a very white positive orientation, just like Booker T. Washington in terms of getting funding and approval from the civilized quote unquote world. When Garvey gets to Harlem and joins the Liberty League, that's where he learns race first for Black people, right? So if you compare what Garvey is saying before his tenure in the Liberty League and after his tenure in the Liberty League, it's completely different. After his time in Harrison's Liberty League, Garvey is saying, forget about white folks. We need to do this for self. We need to work. Garvey says, all of the white forces, the Democrats, the Republicans, the socialists, these are all white forces. We're not going to be able to advance ourselves through that. We need a Black, what we now think of as a Black nationalist, right, or Black internationalist approach, where it's do for self. Harrison taught that to Garvey. And this is why it's going to be difficult, I think, for people to discount what Harrison's critique is, because he's foundational in Garvey. He's formative in Garvey's development, right? And not just Garvey, but Garveyism. And this is the other point that I think Renee was getting to, is that sometimes we use an individual like Garvey as a stand-in for this larger thing. I mean, the UNIA had branches all over the world, in North America, in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, in West and Southern Africa, and in Europe. It had hundreds of branches around the world. So Garveyists in Trinidad were doing something different from Garveyists in Nigeria, who were doing something different from the Garveyists in South Africa, right? I mean, they all had a kind of shared vision of sovereignty, particularly in a time when there were very few independent African countries because they were all colonized by one or another European colonial power. I mean, this is why the flag was so important, the red, black, and green, which, Kenya and many other African countries still use. The flag of Ghana, right, has a black star in the middle of its flag as a direct homage to the Black Star Line of the Garvey movement, because Kwame Nkrumah openly admitted that Garvey had a deep impact on his thinking about African nationalism and sovereignty, right? But again, the idea of a flag, that was first a Liberty League idea, the black, brown, and yellow, which I mentioned, and so a lot of these things can be traced. Harrison is missing from the sort of Garvey historiography, and thankfully, we've done a lot of work. Scholars have done a lot of work to expand our range of understanding of global Garveyism. Scholars like Adam Ewing, for example, have really helped us to see the global dimensions of Garveyism in a different way. And I think that is to its credit that Garveyists in Trinidad or in wherever they were didn't necessarily follow everything that Marcus Garvey said. But if we're dealing with Harrison, it means we're dealing with Harlem, and that's the headquarters. That's where the UNIA headquarters was, where the Negro World offices were, where Marcus Garvey was based, at least for the majority of his time in the United States. And so yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that's helpful, but I feel like the other point I wanted to make to Renee's point is that we also do need to get away from individuals, right? We need to get away from the HNIC, head Negro in charge syndrome, and do like Ella Baker said, right? Ella Baker, also coming out of a Harlem training, she said, we need group-centered leaders rather than leader-centered groups. That's something I think I mentioned before on the program the last time we talked, Jared. I remember you hit the cue to say message.
I'm slow with it today, and I've been having so many problems with the platform lately. I'm afraid to push any more buttons. But
call me crazy, but I think it's difficult to say that too many times, that we need group-centered leaders rather than leader-centered groups. Harrison, is more in that tradition of a group-centered figure. I mean, look at the outdoor university, or the outdoor Grioversity, as I called it, right? He's focused on the masses. He's focused on the people. He had a deliberate and intentional critique of the talented 10th ideology. If we can shift gears a little bit and maybe talk about Du Bois, because, Du Bois, to his credit, in the 1930s becomes radical and Marxist and pro-communist. But prior to that, he was on the talented 10th elitism, which Harrison was dead set against, precisely because he believed that the intellectuals needed to come down from their Sinais, right, down from their ivory towers, and actually relate to the masses of people who Harrison was really most concerned with and placed at the center of his worldview.
I definitely want to leave room for all of that, but I can't. So I've said before that these popular men of this time, Du Bois, Briggs, Garvey, off the top, engaged in public media debates as in ways that would be perfectly fitted to YouTube in the 21st century. You do point out that Harrison made it a conscious effort to say, I'm not doing all of this in overt. I'm not going to do silly overt stuff. I'm not going to do stuff that promotes me over my collective organized work. I mean, you're very clear about it. At the same time, though, before we leave Garvey entirely, I did want to come back and raise that question again about how, am I wrong in that it seemed really petty, given, all, contradictions aside, notwithstanding, that I'm saying it, that he works with Garvey's ex to do a biography, to help her do her biography. Like that seemed, and then you even point out that he even acknowledges how he's loving all the inside dirt he's getting on Garvey. I was like, he did that, and then the way you talked about how he reviewed some other popular work as a way of criticizing Garvey within Garvey's own Negro World paper. I mean, Harrison might have said, he was clear, like, I don't want to engage publicly and do silly stuff, but he was not, completely unwilling to engage in some, as Manny is saying, a little bit messiness. It was a little bit messy. Am I wrong? How do you, what do you,
Well,
and then please.
Here's the issue.
Yeah.
Here's the issue. Coming out against Garvey publicly was not an easy thing for Harrison to do for a couple of reasons. I mean, number one, he's drawing his salary from editing the Negro World, so he's not trying to find himself out of a job because he's actually getting his main source of income, at least in 1920 and 21, from editing Garvey's newspaper. But the other thing is that there's a gangsterism to Garveyism. That is, the people who ended up in the other world because of their criticisms of Garvey. I'm talking about people like Reverend James Eason, who was assassinated by Garvey loyalists right before he was about to testify in Garvey's mail fraud trial. Right? I'm talking about people like Laura Kofi, a Garveyist preacher in Florida, who she was also assassinated by Garvey loyalists. The Black communist Alfred Levy in the 1930s was assassinated by Garvey loyalists, right? So it's a little bit risky to come out publicly against Garvey because of the consequences that might bring to you. And that is why Harrison had to camouflage some of his critiques of Garvey by, for example, his review of Emperor Jones, the Eugene O'Neill play, which was basically a sort of parody of the kind of, the sort of silly, authoritarian, egoistic nature of Marcus Garvey. Harrison reviewed the play favorably as a way to kind of endorse or to critique Garvey indirectly, right? Not saying that Marcus Garvey X, Y, and Z, but saying like, here, this play is showing this, and this about this, Jamaican leader who's duping his followers and like getting them to go along with all these chaotic plans and notions that he has. So that I think that's a subtle thing. It's like you can't always just critique people outright because there are consequences for it. So that's my sort of response to what you're saying there.
No, thank you. That makes sense. Yeah. But I'm sorry, Renee. Did you were you cool with him moving into Du Bois, or was there something you wanted to?
No, we can move forward. I just, that was really my whole point, and I really appreciated these chapters and this kind of in-depth conversation about the history of Garveyism, right? Because to me, again, and I don't want to beleaguer it to death, but like we miss so much because we're only given what people allow us to have in that moment, right? So if people want to continue to focus on, if you want to focus and say like all these things are just because of Garvey, and you forget that there is an entire school of thought that is based on, that is not about a person, that was not made, and now we learn like is not even from that person, right? Like literally like someone else was part of the teaching that created the whole thought process behind what that person put out. So it's not to say that the information wasn't relevant or that the work wasn't relevant or that the influence wasn't relevant, but it's to point out that we have to get away from this idea of this one person and this one figure being the thing that we're all like chasing behind and supporting. It has to be about something greater, or we're never going to get away from being propagandized. Like it's all part of the problem. So, but yes, let's please move on.
Yeah. I'll just say again, I humbly submit that no matter how much you think you know about Garvey and Garveyism, this book will challenge you. and might actually blow your mind in certain respects, one way or the other. Whether you're pro Garvey or not, I think this book will offer you some radically new perspectives on Garvey and Garveyism.
But as you said, but again, Harrison was a principled, had smoke for everybody, and everyone could get it. That's why we named the Hate Awards after him a couple of years ago. This is why we honor him. So it wasn't just this Garvey thing. This was he was like, and then he said, and let me turn over here and look at Mr. Talented 10th and look at what he's been up to. So could you talk a little bit about his issues with Du Bois?
Yeah, so initially Harrison really respected Du Bois, particularly in terms of the struggle against the accommodationism of, Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee machine. I mean, Harrison is a case study in what it meant to be a victim, or a survivor, I should say, of the Tuskegee machine, because Harrison, lost his postal job. He was a postal clerk until about 1909. When he wrote some op-eds in a Black New York newspaper critical of Booker T. Washington and defending Washington's critics, including Du Bois, including William Monroe Trotter and others. So Harrison initially was a Du Bois man, as they were called. But over time, Harrison came to see that Du Bois had his limitations as well. And this comes to a head most sharply in World War I. Right? Because during World War I, Du Bois actually attempts to become a captain in military intelligence in order to spy on Black radicals and police, Black dissent and make sure that, there's no Negro subversion, quote unquote, right? That Black folks remain loyal and patriotic. And this shocked people because Du Bois was the voice of, the Black community for many, right? He was voicing the grievances that folks had about lynching, about segregation, about Jim Crow disfranchisement, right, of political rights in the South. And what happened was, basically Du Bois, there was a lot of pressure, first of all, right? You had the Sedition and the Espionage Acts, which made anti-war dissent illegal in the country, and many people were imprisoned, right? Eugene Debs, A. Philip Randolph, Chandler Owen, Kate O'Hare, a bunch of socialists and pacifists and anti-war folks were actually jailed for opposing World War I. So on the one hand, you had to avoid getting jailed and imprisoned and or deported, right? A lot of folks were deported. Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, right? There were people that were deported as well, much like what's happening today. If you criticize Palestine as a foreigner, you might get deported, right? So that's one challenge. But then Du Bois, although he avoided, repression, he ended up capitulating because the editorials he was writing for the crisis, that the government came knocking. Hey, tone down those editorials. We need patriotic, and the government organized a whole conference for Black newspaper editors, including Du Bois, to basically hammer home to them the importance of loyalty and maintaining Negro loyalty during the war. Harrison exposed
and according to your book, that conference was a direct, it was scheduled at the time it was scheduled to directly conflict with the other Black writers who were trying to put a different narrative.
Yes, it was deliberately designed to steal the thunder of the Liberty Congress of Negro Americans, which elected Hubert Harrison as its chairman and which put a petition to the federal government right in the middle of the war about lynching, right, and about segregation and disfranchisement. And the way that they avoided arrest and imprisonment and deportation was they framed their struggle for Black rights in the language of the government itself, right? So Woodrow Wilson had declared that the US would enter the war to make the world safe for democracy. And so what they said was, hey, if we're making the world safe for democracy, we need democracy. Harrison said this directly. He said, yeah, let's make the whole world safe for democracy. Tennessee, as well as Turkey, need to be safe for democracy. And that's what we're going to fight to accomplish, right? And it's funny because the FBI and the censorship apparatus was very frustrated with this because they realized these guys are saying somewhat seditious things by raising Black grievances in a time of war, but they weren't actually uttering seditious words because it was all framed in the president's own language. And so this was the kind of clever strategy that Harrison and the people at the Liberty Congress, which was a national, it was the only independent national gathering of Black dissenting voices during wartime, right? Met in Washington, D.C., and people like William Monroe Trotter, Irena Mormon Blackstone, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., Hubert Harrison. These are some of the folks who were involved in that. Harrison, as I said, was elected chairman of the Congress, which was the first time I think he got a sort of national level recognition as a Black figure. And Harrison writes the article, The Dissent of Dr. Du Bois, which exposes the fact that Du Bois, the reason why Du Bois was now calling on Black people to forget their special grievances and, get behind the war effort, even though 3 years prior he had been analyzing the roots of the war as an imperialist war, was that it was because Du Bois was applying for a government job, specifically a job in military intelligence. And this really harmed Du Bois's stature, because once people realized that he was selling out, right, and he was toning down his criticisms of racial oppression because he wanted to draw a salary from the NAACP and the government at the same time, he lost a lot of stature, right? And Du Bois, to his credit, he regretted that decision for the rest of his life, and he writes about it in his autobiographies, subsequently, about how that was just a really dark period for him. And I think this is one of the reasons why Harrison's name never appears in the Crisis, right? You can go through the whole archive of the Crisis, you won't find Hubert Henry Harrison, because he really gave Du Bois a tough time during World War I, and really exposed the sellout that Du Bois was up to in that moment.
I love the principled behavior of this is a generational problem. You disagree with me, I erase you, I omit you and ignore you. There will be no engagement of the argument or the debate. But yeah.
I want to tell one other story about Harrison and Du Bois from much earlier, 1908. The genealogy, or the genesis, I should say, of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois's monumental kind of magnum opus work, where he's reinterpreting, Reconstruction from a Black angle of vision. Harrison was teaching a course on Reconstruction from the Negro's side in 1908, 1909, somewhere there. And he gives his course notes, to his friend Charles Burroughs, who would become the husband of Williana Jones Burroughs, one of the first Black women communists. And because Charles knows Du Bois, and Harrison's like, hey, send these to Du Bois. I want to get his feedback on this. So Charles, takes the notes to Du Bois, presumably. And the very next year is when Du Bois gives his first address at the American Historical Association on the Negro during Reconstruction. This is around 1910. And so, there's a sense in which I think Harrison actually nudged Du Bois towards what becomes one of his most important works, the reinterpretation of the Civil War and Reconstruction from a Black angle of vision. Because Harrison studied the history, he loved history, he loved politics, and he had a whole reinterpretation of Abraham Lincoln's role, which foreshadows people like Lerone Bennett, who writes famously the book Forced into Glory, about Abraham Lincoln's white dream. Harrison, was one of the first people, if not the first, to say that Lincoln was not the great emancipator, that he was okay with making slavery perpetual in 1861, that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free anybody, but was more of a sort of a PR move. And there's a whole argument there. But one quote, my favorite quote, is about Harrison in the Civil War. He said, "The nation did not save the Negro saved the nation." And he's saying this again, like a decade or two before Black Reconstruction. I mean, that's one of the arguments that Du Bois makes, right? That the enslaved people themselves actually were the decisive factor in the North winning the war. Harrison has all these ways of like taking very complex and important ideas and making them concise, right? And exposing the myths of things like the great emancipator myth of Abraham Lincoln, when he says, the nation did not save the Negro saved the nation.
Look, I feel so discombobulated. I don't know why you did this to me, Brian. I'm like, how did we get to, we got to 1240. I got like 3 pages of like, don't forget about this stuff. I feel like Jared is gonna be laughing at me. Like, this is I'm very rarely like this. I feel very like all over the place. And I think it's because I had so many like, oh shit, wow moments as I was reading the book. And it was mostly because Harrison is interwoven within the historical record in such a way that the fact that he has been written out of the narrative is fucking like, this is wild to me, right?
Yes.
It is wild. And as I'm reading like all these, like these little things that pop up that I'm like, wait, I'm like, I know about this, like this thing, like we started talking about Schomburg and how he was working with Schomburg before he decided to move his collection to Harlem, which Harrison was a part of him doing.
Yes.
And like thinking about the fact that, we're talking, why I just had a note to go to Schomburg because I wanted to look up something after talking to Kehinde Andrews, because he found all this information at the shop. So
can I just real quick say something about that? If anybody listening knows people in the Schomburg, I would like to do an event there. I'm actually a Schomburg Fellow alumnus. I did a fellowship there about 3 years ago, which allowed me to write the Free Love chapter and do the research for that. And I've been trying to reach out to them to do an event, but they're so busy with the 100th anniversary, 100 years of Schomburg. They have all these centennial events and celebrations. So I think that's maybe why they're not getting back to me as quickly as I'd like. But part of my argument is like, hey, this is a perfect year to actually have a book event about Hubert Harrison, because as you just mentioned, a century ago, 1925, Harrison helped, he was part of the committee that helped move Schomburg's books from Brooklyn, where Schomburg lived, up to Harlem, where they went to form what is now the Schomburg Center at the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. So yeah, I hope to get there, later this year if I can, or maybe next year. Whenever they're ready, I would really like to do an event there, because also Harrison helped to build that library. He was one of the patrons of that library, and he would speak on the street corner right there, 135th Street in Lenox, to massive audiences of people, and he would encourage them to go into the library and read and check out books for free and gain more knowledge as a result. So he's a key player in the formation of this now very lasting and rightly celebrated institution.
I mean, I don't know anybody there, but I might know somebody who knows somebody who's there. So let me, I'll shake that branch and see.
Is this true that Brian Jones is at the Schomburg? Is this right?
He used to be at the Schomburg. He's now working at the main branch. Yeah, I'm in touch with Brian. He'll probably join me if I do an event. There, but he's no longer working at the Schomburg. But yeah, I met Brian Jones in the ISO. In fact, it was Brian Jones who wrote the review of Perry's first volume in 2009 that I first encountered any mention of Harrison. So I'm grateful to Brian Jones for that review, because I might never have found out about Harrison without him.
So there's that. So one of the other really interesting things about Harrison, which the Harlem connection, which to me was truly, truly fascinating, was this unearthing of the fact that the Harlem Renaissance was a creation for white capital, which I was like, no fucking way. And so reading that history and that information for me was very, because, as as a person with a bachelor's degree in African American studies, you know, the Harlem Renaissance was one of those things, right, that you get consistently taught and retaught, and that comes back around consistently as this idea of like this moment in time when like Black literature and poetry, and this is when it, you know, it became like there was this renaissance, and to read like, nah, that's not really what happened. Right? But not just that that's not really what happened, but like here's all the evidence that there was no actual renaissance, but that you know, here's where the white people came in and picked and choose what was going to be the thing that was going to become popular. And here are, again, as usual, the Black people who played gatekeeper in order to assist this process of the white people. And even his explaining as a Harlemite, like watching as that the transportation line, as the white people, the little bit of white people came in the morning to run their businesses, as all the Black people left to go to do work, you know, in other parts of the city. And then when all the Black people came back, the white people all left. But then here came a whole other slew of white people. Like this was fascinating for me. And now, like, I can never see the Harlem Renaissance again. So thanks for ruining that. But it's a fair thing to ruin given the history.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about the so-called Harlem Renaissance is that it was a framework that was developed by Alain Locke, right, in his 1925 volume, The New Negro Anthology, which reinterpreted the new Negro, the radical new Negro of Harrison's generation, you know, the race radical, class radical, and sex radical new Negro of, you know, the socialist, communist, Garveyist, blues women generation, as a renaissance, as it shifted the meaning of that term to an artistic renaissance, but not just everybody and anyone's art, but specifically the art that white publishers could market to white audiences, right? And so that framework is very much a white capitalist framework in many ways. And the funny thing about it is that even the artists who participated in that, even Alain Locke himself would end up renouncing and relinquishing their investment in the Renaissance narrative because they began to see that it was actually, as Alain Locke said, a Negrophile fad, right? That it was about hand selecting the most non-threatening exponents, or I should say productions of art, and marketing those to white audiences as the Negro, you know, it's something kind of exoticized that was a new market, you know, in terms of white readers of novels and poetry and things of that nature. Langston Hughes ends up, you know, renouncing the Renaissance. Claude McKay ends up renouncing the Renaissance. Hey, David, can you turn the water off? Thanks.
I'm busy. This is a big time interview.
It's a big time interview, man. Yeah. So my last chapter is called The Renaissance School of Negro History, because there's a whole structure of analysis, right, that has grown up on the basis of the notion of a so-called Renaissance in Harlem that from the beginning was consciously and deliberately designed to exclude Black communists, Black socialists, Garveyist, you know, free-loving and otherwise radical examples of Black art for the non-threatening stuff. And so the funny story I love to tell, which I mentioned a couple times in the book, right, is that Harrison famously said, "The matter of a Negro literary renaissance in Harlem is like the snakes of Ireland. There isn't any." Now, he didn't mean there was no interesting Black art in Harlem. What he meant was that people who are pushing the Renaissance narrative are demonstrating their ignorance about the rich tradition of Black literary production from the 19th century all the way up to the present. I'm talking about William Wells Brown. I'm talking about Charles Chestnut. I'm talking about Pauline Hopkins and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Laurence Dunbar, and so on and so on and so on and so forth, right? Like, the idea of a Renaissance was white people discovering the Negro, not knowing that there's a rich literary tradition in African American culture going back to the 1800s, right? And they think they're discovering something new, right? They think they've never seen this before. And so that's part of the marketing aspect of it, right? And it becomes this school of thought, because Harrison, if he was nothing else, he was a quote unquote Renaissance man, in the sense that he was multidimensional, he was multifaceted, he was learned in many disciplines and many schools of thought. So the question then becomes, how does a so-called Harlem Renaissance exclude the Harlem Renaissance man par excellence? And that's because it was designed. That's what it was designed to do, right? Very consciously, very deliberately, and unfortunately, it remains the kind of dominant framework for understanding early 20th century Harlem, which adds another reason why people don't know anything about the Hubert Harrisons of the world.
Listen, that chapter was a wild ride for me, I have to say. And I love, the equal energy hate, as Jared puts it, that he actually, like, he made a point. Harrison, I'm saying, when I say he, basically was like, I dare you to try and come up with like a time frame in which there was no writer that deserved this type of respect, like before this Harlem Renaissance, this quote unquote Harlem Renaissance. And only one person answered, and their answer was basically like, what a stupid question, right? Like, so like, to me, the idea was, it was such an eye-opening moment for me to really understand once again how much we are guided by these ideas of what things were, right? What the history was, what made this thing, like, why was Harlem so important in the 1920s? And then to really understand, like, well, this all makes sense, because if we're so busy focusing on Harlem and the arts and the music and the shows and all these things, we're not talking about all the lynchings, right? We're not talking about all the communities that were destroyed. We're not talking about Red Summer. Like, we're not talking all the things that were going on that were literally counterproductive to the ability for Black people to live and breathe. Right? Like, those things are not important anymore. Let's look at the art, right? It's such a fascinating diversion. Like, and
it's not art in general, right? We're not looking at socialist art. We're not looking at communist art. We're not looking at Garveyist art. We're not looking at the blues women and their art. We're looking at the non-threatening. Like, Locke's volume has a piece by Claude McKay, for example, which I talk about in the book, right? And this piece, it was a poem that was a very pointed attack. It's called, original title was The White House. And Claude McKay, the queer Jamaican, Marxist, he writes this poem that's like a sharp critique of the anti-Black racism of the White House. And Locke changes the title from The White House to White Houses, which just totally like neuters the vociferous attack that McKay is making on the White House racism, and it makes it like, oh, White Houses, like there's something wrong with White Houses, like what? And McKay is shocked that Locke would do this, right? But it's a perfect example of the neutering impact, because McKay was actually a radical, but the piece as it appears in the New Negro Anthology is very obviously, consciously, and deliberately de-radicalized, so that it can fit into this model of white marketable, what one of the white publishers said, we want art, not anger, right? That was something that the white publishing industry was telling to these younger artists, right? The Jesse Fawcett's and the Langston Hugheses, right? And all these folks who were trying to get a leg up and trying to enter a very white dominated industry, and being told, look, you got to just tone all that stuff down. Like, don't give us anger, don't give us politics, give us, things that we can celebrate in a sort of patriotic ethos. And again, a lot of these folks turned against that, but yet the myth lives on.
like much of the book, that to Renee's point, that section, that chapter was phenomenally informative and well written, and a beautiful challenge, not only in terms of the history, but to how we interpret how fame and popularity manifests today. It's this white liberal sponsorship of Black popularity is an ongoing crisis. I know we're running out of time for this session, and you will be back. We will.
I know I'm mad as hell right now. Like I'm so mad we ran out. We didn't even get to the socialism fight. We didn't get to like why the race versus socialism was a big. Go ahead, Jared.
Well, I thought one way of at least alluding to some of that, I did think for my last question, at least for this session, I did want to ask you to comment on something that I thought you said, that I really like how you put this in terms of how to describe what Harrison left for us. And you said here that, said differently, Harrison offers a unique point of departure for a kind of unified field theory of radical politics that reveals revolutionary possibilities inherent in the integration of liberatory traditions that are too often compartmentalized from one another, end quote. So if you could maybe just talk a little bit about that unified field theory approach to revolution that you attribute to Harrison, and I think that's a great way of doing it. And I'll also quickly shout out my man, Dr. Todd Stephen Burroughs, who many years was the first one to put me on to that point about the shortcomings of what happened with the Harlem Renaissance, the very white sponsored, but this unified field theory approach.
Yeah, sure. Before I do that, I just want to make the announcement that I'm actually going to be speaking at Bois and Poets. For anybody who's in Washington, D.C. or the DMV area, tomorrow, I'll be at Bois and Poets, the 14th and V location at 5 p.m. Doing a book event there. So I would welcome folks to come out and continue the conversation there, folks who are listening now. If you know anybody who's in the DMV, maybe you're in California or Texas or wherever, but if you know folks in Washington, D.C., please let them know. You can point them to my website, briankwoba.com, which has information about the event, a link to register and stuff like that. So yeah, would love to continue the conversation there. But to get to your question, Jared, yeah, the unified field theory is kind of, it was a way for me to try to understand the power and the meaning of Harrison's restoration and what he allows us to do, right? Which is to think along multiple radical lines in a single frame, because Harrison was a socialist, right? And a sort of class conscious figure and a theoretician and organizer. He was also a radical internationalist. He was also, deeply impactful on the race first tradition. He was also a free lover. He was also a free thinker, right? We didn't even talk about Harrison's critique of Christianity and the church and religion more generally, which is a key part of his thought as well. And so you have all of these radicalisms together in one place, versus a situation that you often find where you'll have a book that's just about Black Marxism, or a book that's just about, Black nationalism, or a book that's just about, arts and culture and the Renaissance, or a book that's just about Africa. And that's another thing we didn't even talk about, Harrison's African identity in politics. He identified as an untamed, untamable African at a time when the Bronx Zoo placed a Congolese man named Otabenga in the monkey house section of the zoo, right? I mean, there's extreme Afrophobia in this moment. And Harrison is here saying, I'm an untamed, untamable African. We get to think all of these things together. And that's what I mean when I say like a unifying kind of theory, is that my book, said differently, covers a wide range of topics, everything from arts and culture to sex and religion, science and technology. That's a whole other area we didn't get to talk about. And the climate, the climate crisis question, labor.
And Tesla, which you blew my mind, throwing in at the end.
That's a little bonus I threw in at the end, putting Harrison in conversation metaphorically speaking, with Nikola Tesla. So yeah, it's bringing a lot of different things into one place, which I think helps all of them become clearer. They can illuminate each other, just like race radicalism and class radicalism and, religious or spiritual radicalism, erotic radicalism. Like when you start to see each of them in light of the others, you begin to kind of deepen your sense of how all these interlocking systems work together. And I think that's one of the sort of lasting contributions that Harrison leaves us with, right? Is a model for how to do that, how to combine many different radical traditions into a single frame for deeper insight, greater clarity, and hopefully more effectiveness in our activism. Because, I come at this work not just as a scholar, but also as an activist. As I mentioned, was on my first protest in 2004. And I've been involved in a lot of movements since then. And so I'm writing this not primarily even for a scholarly audience, but for a more general audience, because just like Harrison, I want to offer the knowledge to the people, and not have it just be confined to a scholarly or academic conversation.
Well, you did that because it was so many things. And I really, when we get off, I'm gonna make sure I reach out, because the race first versus class first, socialism, why he left ISO, the IW, there was so much information. And I took some clarity with regard to the race first, class first argument, that I don't know that I ever in my conscious mind put together this idea that, well, these people who are telling you it's class first, they've already put race first. Like,
yep.
they've already put whiteness first. And
yep.
so don't forget that part. And I was like, well, what? Like, oh. What? Like, head explosion. And so I really, I invite you to come back. I hope you will, so that we can, engage in this again, because I really do. I want to get into this whole the socialist background and the electoral politics, and we didn't get to any of that because there's just so much. And I truly, I said it at the start, and after these 2 hours, I mean it even more. This was a wonderfully written deep dive into something that gave me so much information that I never had, that I truly appreciate, and that I'll be continuing to recommend this. And if you end up in the New York, New Jersey area, please, I am quick to put together a book talk. So, it'll be intimate. It won't be like 100 people in the room, but it'll be 50 or so people who really have an interest in what you have to say. So, I would love that.
I'm happy to do an event like that, because again, this is knowledge that belongs to the people, and that's really what I tried to do in this book. So any chance I get, any way that I can reach people, whether it's a small group or a large group, we can even do an event online if you want to. I'm happy to.
On it. Look, you ain't saying nothing but a word, Jared. No, I'll be quick. Jared, come do this thing. So on it. I appreciate that.
All right, everybody, good people, please avail yourselves of the links put in the chat and in the show description. Get the book, and we'll be looking forward to the next round of conversations with you, Professor Kwoba. Thank you much, and congratulations once again. And salute to Hubert Henry Harrison. And,
thank you.
Again, much like another luminary, and like Hubert would have said, peace only if you're willing to fight for it. Like Fred Hampton. And
thank you for having me. I hope to see some folks tomorrow at Bois and Poets at 5 p.m. and in other spaces and venues, online and in person, going forward. Thank you so much, Jared. Thank you, Renee. It's been a wonderful 2 hours. I look forward to coming back.
We do too. All right, everybody. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, put this in your socials, share this with other people so they can get this word as well. And we'll catch you next time right here at Saturday with Renee.